Today we're going to learn about using 3D with After Effects, starting with some simple transformations and working our way up to rendering a full 3D scene. And we'll do this in three different stages: a very basic stage, an intermediate stage, and then we'll pull out all the stops for the last one. So we're going to start by making a project in After Effects. So go ahead and open that up, save a new project, and then what you want to do is import that gear image that I provided in Moodle. So I'm going to import that now. And I'm going to import it as footage this time. Click OK. And then I can just bring it in as merged layers. This file only has one layer in it, so there's really nothing to deal with here. It's just a simple Illustrator image of a gear. Now let's make a new composition. Normally, we would make our compositions at 1080p, but since we're working in 3D in this case, sometimes that can put a real stress on older laptops. So for this exercise at least, we'll work in 720. If you have a newer laptop, you could go ahead and work in 1080, and you might want to use 1080 for your final projects. I'm going to use the HD TV 720 29.97 settings. So that's 1280 by 720 pixels. And I'm going to set the length of this animation to be 10 seconds long. Click OK, and you'll make a new comp. And the comp is open down here. Now let's add the gear to the timeline. And it's a little bit big, so let's go into our transform settings and let's scale it down to 40%. That should do it. Now we're going to create a very simple animation for this gear. We're going to have it rotate all the way around just once, so we have some movement for the animation. So to do that, make sure your playhead's at the very beginning. Let's keyframe the rotation layer. Then I'm going to drag my playhead all the way to the end. We'll add a keyframe there. And this time we'll set it to 1 full revolution. That's what that first number means. So if I scrub this now, you can see that the gear will turn all the way around 1 full revolution. Go ahead and save it. Okay, now the simplest thing that we can do in terms of 3D is simply to turn this layer into a 3D layer. This works with layers, it works with compositions, works with movies, animations, anything you put in here. If you go to the layer and you look over here at the settings to the right, you've got these 3 boxes. And we want to check the one underneath the cube that turns this into a 3D layer. As soon as we do that, you'll see that some of the settings for transform have changed. Now our anchor point, position, scale, they all have 3 settings instead of 2. So instead of just an X and a Y, X side to side, and Y up and down, we now have a third setting, which is Z, the Z axis, which is depth, how close to us or how far away it is. Also, under rotation, we have 3 settings for rotation: an X rotation, a Y rotation, and a Z rotation. And you can see that the Z rotation is keyframed. It took our basic animation that we had before and it changed it to a rotation around just one axis, the Z axis. We can rotate things around other axes as well. So for example, I can do this to rotate it around the X axis, or I could do this to rotate it around the Y axis. I'm going to set the Y rotation to 0. Let's set the X rotation to 0 at the very beginning. And let's keyframe this layer. So we'll start it there and go all the way to the end. Let's add a keyframe, and this time let's have it rotate around the X axis one time. And now we'll end up with an animation like this. It's flipping end over end while it's spinning. This is technically a 3D animation. We have an object that's moving in 3D space, but really it's commonly referred to as 2.5D because we have a flat object that has no depth, but we're moving it in 3D space. And this can be a really good technique to animate type. You can have type spin, you can have it come flying in, you can do all these things, but in each of these cases, you're animating a flat two-dimensional object. For a lot of things you do in After Effects, this is all you're going to need. So now let's look at what happens if we combine multiple layers together. So we're going to try and make a solid layer here, layer, new, solid. And let's make it, I'm going to make mine a light yellow. I think that would be good. And we'll just make it the same size as our composition, 1280 by 720. Click OK. After Effects will drop it into the layer stack down here. Right now it's on top of our gear. I'm going to move it behind. And you'll notice that now when I scrub this, the gear moves perfectly in front of the yellow background. Right now, these two are not interacting at all. And the reason is because the gear is a 3D layer, but our solid color is not a 3D layer. So the solid color layers can exist alongside the 3D layers, but they don't interact with each other. As long as this yellow layer is behind the gear, no matter what the gear does, the yellow layer is going to appear behind it. But let's see what happens if we take this solid yellow layer and turn it into a 3D layer. At first glance, it doesn't seem like anything has changed. But if I scrub this, look what happens. Pretty weird. What the heck is going on? The easiest way to see what's going on is to change our view of this scene. And so far, we've just been looking at the scene head on. And pretty much everything we've been doing in After Effects so far is about looking at the scenes head on. But when we create a 3D space, we also create a 3D camera. By default, After Effects will create one for us called the active camera. But we can change these cameras as well. And if I go to this list, you'll see there are a bunch of different views that we have. And if I go down to Custom View 1, that one will give us sort of a 3/4 view. Keep in mind, the objects haven't changed. They're still at their same locations. All we've done is picked up our camera and moved around the room to look at them from a different angle. Now, if I scrub through this, we can get a better sense of what's going on. You can see that that solid color layer is now like a very thin wall. And the gear is like a saw blade slicing through it whenever it turns at an angle. If we want to get a different view of this, we can go up here to the camera move tools. And the easiest one to use is the orbit tool. So I'm going to click that. And now I can spin around and look at this from a different angle. Again, I'm not moving the objects. I'm only moving my view of the objects. And here that we can see both sides of the wall, you can really see what that gear is doing now and why it seems like it disappears at certain points. I want to return back to this first view that I had with the custom view because that's a really handy one. So I'm going to go up to View, and I'm going to go down to Reset 3D View, and it'll put it back to where it was. Let's go back to our main view now, the active camera. We're looking straight on, and what I want to do is I want to move that wall back so that it is not interacting with the gear at all. The gear isn't slicing through it. So to do that, let's open up the solid color layer, go down to Transform. I'm going to look at the position here. Remember, X is side to side, Y is up and down, and Z is depth. How far away from us is it? So if I increase that, I can actually move this layer back in space. And I'm going to move it back to about 300. Should be just right. And if I switch to our other view, custom view 1, you can see what I did. I pushed it back so it's no longer interacting. And if I scrub it, we can see that it's now far enough back that it won't interfere with the gear. Let's go back to the main view again, active camera. There's just one problem. Moving it back shrunk it up, and now it's not big enough to cover our whole background. So I'm going to go to scale, and I'm going to increase the scale of this layer to 200%. Now it's just bigger. It's still farther back, but it's bigger. If I scrub this, it looks pretty much exactly like it did before we went through all this business of turning it into a 3D layer and moving its Z position and scaling it and everything else. So you might be asking, a rational person would ask, why in the world did we just go through all this if it's going to look exactly the same? Well, the reason is because now that both of these are 3D objects, they can actually interact with one another. So let's try this out. Let's see if we can make the gear interact with the layer back there. So we're going to play with light. The first thing I'm going to do is go up to our gear layer, open it up, and go down to Material Options. And there's a bunch of things here. We'll ignore most of them for now. But the one thing I do want to switch is I want to change it from Cast Shadows Off to On. That way, when light hits this object, it will cast shadows on any other objects in the scene. We can close that up. Of course, if we scrub through this, there are no shadows. Nothing's happening. And the reason is because we don't have any lights yet. If you don't have any specific lights in your scene, After Effects will just render it with the default colors. But as soon as we create a light, things are going to change. So let's do that. Let's go up to Layer, New, Light. And the light that we're going to create is a spotlight. And let's set the intensity to be 150%. Then go ahead and click OK. Now look what happens. Light, there's actually a light object that exists in 3D space. It's pointed at our gear, and some of the light is hitting the gear, some of the light is being blocked, and it's casting a shadow on the solid yellow color layer behind. And if we scrub this, you'll see that the shadow is rendering right along with it. So really, it's as simple as that. We just create a light and add it to our 3D scene, and now things will interact. You might have noticed this light is, it's doing some weird things to our scene. It's changing the color of the gear itself. It's a little too hot. It's being blown out and it's become pure white. Also, everything else has become pitch black. This is the only light in the scene. So to balance that light a little bit, we're going to create what's called an ambient light. An ambient light doesn't have a specific starting point. It's not casting its light on a specific surface. You can think of it almost like sunlight. It just exists everywhere. Although, yes, technically I know sunlight is coming from the sun, but, you know, it was all I could think of at that moment. So let's make a new ambient light. Layer, New, Light. And this time I'm going to switch it from spot to ambient. And we're going to bring the intensity down for this. Bring it down to about 50%. And click OK. Now things are lit a little more evenly. The gear is still being blown out because the spotlight is shining directly on it, but the yellow background is much more evenly lit, and the shadow feels a lot more convincing as well. The last thing I want to show you in this stage is how we can play with that light. So if we go down to the spotlight, and we go to the transform options, you'll see this first one is called a point of interest. The point of interest is a complicated way of saying what is the light pointing at. And if I change these values, say I change the X value, I can point that light over to the left. In fact, let's bring that point of interest all the way down to 100 on the X value. Now you can see that some of the gray is coming back from the gear because the light isn't hitting it directly. We're not going to go into this in great detail, but I want to remind you that every one of these settings that we're playing with can be keyframed. And let's try that with this point of interest. With the playhead at the very beginning, let's create a keyframe. We'll set that to 100 on the X. And then let's go all the way to the end. And this time let's set it to 1,000, which will point it the other direction. So now we have a bunch of things happening. Our gear is turning in 3D space, and we have a light that's panning across the scene from left to right, casting shadows on the solid yellow layer behind. And if I go ahead and render this out, this is what it looks like.